Good evening. Hey everybody, Jimmy Dean, alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. It has been a mountaintop experience for me. I was trying to figure out how many of the speakers thus far I've hosted. And because I'm a host AA member, except for right now. And Pat and I went to Brownwood together about 20-odd years ago, which is 150 miles west of Dallas, and I was supposed to get her and Vince couldn't come, and I was just thinking about, I'd probably been sober 5 or 6 years at the time, and, all it is just a hosting gig, right? That's all it is. It's just, I'm going to pick somebody up at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, and I'm going to make sure they get from point A to point B, and this is somebody who's, well-versed in travel for Alcoholics Anonymous, being on programs in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I can't tell you anything about the details of any of the conversation or what, Pat had to listen to from the 7-year guy on the way to Brownwood, but that experience is burned into my consciousness because a quote-unquote a stranger in Alcoholics Anonymous made the host feel right at home. And I think so that's root and branch. It's the essence of certainly what I've felt during the course of this weekend. Some people, of course, I know, all of them effective communicators in Alcoholics Anonymous, sharing, very deep and intimate personal experiences with our program of recovery, with the steps. And so my topic, I want to thank Bob and Marnie for the opportunity to come, the invitation to come. I want to thank the committee. I've been on committees. Probably a lot of people in this room have been on a lot of committees. I've been on primary committees and secondary committees and subcommittees and ham hock committees. And it takes a lot of work. Least possible organization, but there's a lot of least possible organization in order to get this done. We've got people that are greeters/goons to make sure that you don't get in here unless you got your credentials. They haven't had to slam anybody up against the wall yet, but I'm going to tell you, a couple of those guys, they're waiting to be able to slam somebody up against the wall, and I get it. I'm going to slam a lot of people up against the wall when I came to AA. I was 32 years old and dying of alcoholism. I had absolutely no idea. I could not connect those dots. That's the straightest line you could ever draw. I just wanted that probation officer to quit asking me to come see her every week. And made me blow on those stupid tablets whenever I got in there. She'd say, "My God, what'd you drink last night?" And I'd say, "I haven't had a drink of beverage alcohol since whatever day it was I went to court." She'd make me blow on that tablet and she'd stare at it intently, waiting for it to change color. My parents had died when I was little. My grandmother raised me, and I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this, let you know who's standing behind the podium. And, I wasn't welcome in her home when I came to AA because she was afraid of me. I needed to get that fixed. I'd like to tell you I needed to get that fixed because I knew that was the beginning of what our book would describe as a long period of reconstruction ahead. But in actuality, there was a lot of money over there in that house, and I didn't want anybody else to get that money. I was working for no, that's a lie. I was employed by a little software company when I came to AA. I wasn't really working for them, but they were paying me. They'd known me since I was a little kid, 19. Gone over for beer money. It was a dare by a fraternity brother of mine who said, "Have you ever worked?" And back then there was no Monster.com. I just felt sorry for myself, drove up the Dallas North Tollway and saw a billboard that said, "We'll hire anybody." And I thought, that's for me. And, I'd get in 10:30 or 11 o'clock 2 or 3 days a week, which I thought was pretty good for attendance record. And those people had known me since I was a kid of 19. They get up and they shut their doors. They wanted me to know how disgusted they were. There wasn't anybody in that company that would fire me. I just wanted all that to stop. So through a sequence of events, I found myself around AA. And I've been around AA and I've been in AA, and I'm going to tell you, in AA, in my experience, is much, much better place to be. I also know there's a fundamental difference between going to Alcoholics Anonymous and being in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was going to AA. These people were on fire for Alcoholics Anonymous. They're just like this room full of people tonight. I mean, they were erstwhile enthusiastic members of AA. So that sponsor was trying to work with me. He was giving me all these kind of conditions of sponsorship, right? Call me at 7:30 every morning. And I'd call at 7:32 a.m. I thought that was, you give yourself a 5 or 10 minute rule on either side of the time. And he'd say 7:30 and just hang up. And I got to that home group and put my name on a phone list, and they told me now I was a member of that group, and they made me a greeter for the open speaker meeting on Saturday night. So you came to that open speaker meeting on Saturday night, and I greeted you. Welcome to AA. Good sponsors have good spies. They were watching from around the corners. I've never had any fingers in my chest, but I've had a lot of arms around my shoulder. That sponsor put his arm around my shoulder, walked me around the corner so he could preserve dignity that I did not have. And he said, Jimmy, we have greeters here so people will feel welcome when they come to AA. So I didn't know anything at all about leadership. We're going to talk about the state of our union. It seems like a very heady topic, right? And what in the world, why would I presume as a single member of AA that I could effectively communicate about anything of the magnitude of the state of our union? I had a rich experience, a rich service experience. I floated down the food chain in AA, and I was a bottom feeder for 4 years. I served you, and unless you're from the region that I served, I hope that perhaps you were never harmed by that, right? And I came off the General Service Board in April of 2023, and when I first came on the board in April of 2019, I had watched, as I've done with everything that I've ever learned in Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd watched people serve the fellowship, right, in various capacities, right, through certainly the legacy of unity and our legacy of service, and so as such, I had watched people who, quote unquote, were trustee members of the General Service Board, but the first trustee I can remember having any experience with was at a regional forum back in 1999 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this particular trustee was supposed to make a report to the fellowship. She was unavailable for the dais at her time slot that afternoon. And the chairperson of the particular meeting came up and said, we're going to swap the schedule because Beth had something that precluded her ability to make the trustee report now. And so I didn't really know much about anything back then, and somebody else was at the table where I was at, and they said, oh, she was able to meet with the woman. And what happened was there was a woman who came into that hotel where we were having a General Service Forum, General Service Board Regional Forum, and she had heard something about Alcoholics Anonymous was meeting in that hotel. So we can say all we want about the third legacy of service in Alcoholics Anonymous, but Beth knew why she was trustee, and she and another lady from the General Service Office spent 3 hours that afternoon 12-stepping that woman in the lobby of that hotel. She made a report later, because the report, of course, was secondary to fulfilling the purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous. All of this infrastructure, right? All of these ancillary pieces to AA. Some we're interested in, others we aren't. But not in any instance did I experience what I would consider to be a patronizing tone. I knew that trustees, members of the board, were charged by the fellowship or charged by bill, and the design of the fellowship was something that we call vision. Had little conversations with different friends during the course of the weekend about exactly, what does the AA landscape look like? What is the state of the AA union? I can tell you in our respective home groups, at least the home groups that are represented here, we're on fire for Alcoholics Anonymous. We're on fire for AA. We're doing the business of AA. We're making ourselves available and we're accountable to those who would come to Alcoholics Anonymous and seek what we have to offer, or at least seek enough information so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they think they can buy in here. But somehow that information that is alive and well in most instances at the top of the AA food chain seems to somehow have been filtered, stilted, a little bit distilled as it's trickled down to the tip of the triangle. It's not news or new to have lots of members of Alcoholics Anonymous say New York, them, that, when speaking of either General Service Office or the General Service Board. It's been an interesting dynamic in the last 4 or 5 years in that my experience as a member of the General Service Board is the board has begun to distance itself from the fellowship that it serves. Not by intent or design, but somehow, let's just say, a secondary or tertiary responsibility to providing the fellowship with the materials that the fellowship has requested, rather than the materials that the board decides that the fellowship needs to request. That's not about any individual or specific piece of material, and I'm certainly not trying to anonymize any particular topic. There seems to have been a conscience that at least is partially formed in office and boards, that the result of is that there seem to be some fundamental problems with the efficacy of our delivery of the message of recovery as contained in the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I don't believe that that problem is something that was identified in the trenches where we have requested certain additional tools in order to help us more effectively communicate our message. And in that regard, we're upside down. Because the tip of the triangle is, let's just say, providing various and sundry pieces of material that I don't believe there's been an informed group conscience in Alcoholics Anonymous to support production of said materials. And it seems to me that the fellowship, we would all benefit from having a seat at the table and discussions around that. Not just representatives, in other words, your general service representative from your group, district committee members, and certainly your area delegates, but those general service board members that are directly accountable, all of them directly accountable, to the needs and the wants of the fellowship. You know, when all this stuff got cooked up, Bern Smith and Bill Wilson, you know, there's some phenomenal stories about all of that. Bern was not alcoholic. He was a lawyer, high-profile lawyer in New York City, and he really was, quote-unquote, the architect of this thing that's over here in the window shade. Notice they had to drop the font. There's so much info over here on this. The other thing that I think is somewhat of a conundrum for me is this has been publicized, let's say, in the fellowship as being somewhat complicated. The concepts for world service, right? You got to have double-digit sobriety to even read the service manual, you know. There's all kinds of secrets in the service manual. You know, there's a special handshake in order to get you into your area assembly, and I don't find anything complicated about any of this at all, because in most healthy home groups, all this stuff is happening. We know all about the right of decision, the right of participation, the right of appeal. We understand what all that stuff means. Anytime you've ever spoken to a minority voice, that's the fifth concept. It's kind of like I didn't know anything about the common welfare, the first tradition. My gosh, I was on step 1.25. And they were teaching me in that home group what it meant that the group needed to survive, right? We needed to do what we could in order to support the group. So it comes really down, or at least the basis of the conversations which I was able to participate in, it came to actual numbers. And we don't keep any records. We have no idea how many people are members of AA. I mean, you get a better read out of one of those slot machines downstairs. We don't know how many people are in Alcoholics Anonymous. We've always gauged it by sales of the book. Well, the pandemic complicated that, right? And so we really have absolutely, no idea about that. But we said, oh my God, we're obviously not accessible. Right? Not necessarily speaking to that from the framework of the third tradition or the fifth tradition, but let's just, quote unquote, look at the numbers. Well, there were groups, and I'm a member of the Chicago group in Dallas, Texas, so I'm familiar with the AA landscape, certainly in my part of the world, and all of our quote unquote big groups lost huge numbers of AA members, right? In a physical sense. But we don't know anything about where those members are now participating in AA, but we would have these discussions. They'd be on agendas when I was on the board in New York. I mean, what are we going to do? I said, well, who asked us to do anything at all? I mean, it seems to me that certainly we're charged with exercising some degree of vision here, but let's just go out on a limb. If the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous said today, collectively, through an informed group conscience, if the Fellowship of AA said, no more new material, no more, not one single piece of new material is to be produced by boards or office. If that was the mandate from the fellowship through the structure, the board has to execute the mandate. It's the way we're structured. So not that we would be so critical or so dangerously imbalanced that we would do anything collectively to harm Alcoholics Anonymous, but if we actually said, let's just call it a day as a fellowship, that's what has to happen. And so they go, Jimmy, come back in the room, get back in the room. I said, well, I am in the room, but I'd rather get on an airplane and go home than spend 8 or 10 hours talking about something that we can't execute. I mean, we can certainly seed some ideas and perhaps throw some things out there, but other than that, this board has no power. Now, the Class A trustees, it takes them about 3 or 4, non-alcoholics, it takes them about 3 years to learn that. And the best way they learn it is when we vote for new trustees in the conference. There's lots of past delegates in here. There's some current delegates in here. They can tell you all about the elections at the conference. And these trustees watch us vote, and they watch us vote again, and they watch us vote again, then they watch us vote again, and then we ask if somebody wants to vote a 5th time, and there's always a motion in the conference to vote a 5th time, and we pass that, and we vote one more time. We're now into probably the 3rd hour for the first election, and then we put 2 names in a hat, and we pull the person out of the hat. And when we have the closing meeting of the General Service Board, which is right after the conference meeting closes, it's on Saturday, shortest meeting we got, best meeting we got, shortest meeting we got. The Class A trustees say, what just happened? How did you do that? And we said, the group conscience has spoken. And they said, how do you diagram that? Right? And so we began to engage an additional layer of conversation in order to educate them. Now they know about amazing numbers of things. But the intimate nature of the relationships that we form in Alcoholics Anonymous is something that's new to them. The level of trust and accountability that we feel for one another, whether or not we even know each other's first name, is an amazing experience for a non-alcoholic member of the General Service Board. To a man or woman, they will say that they are amazed, really, that we ever get anything done, right? They also are confused by the fact that the legal construct of the board is always secondary to the spiritual power of the fellowship. The spiritual power of the fellowship always supersedes the power of the board. So we have, new pieces of material. Those new pieces of material, I can't speak to, for example, the plain language book. I've not read it from cover to cover. I was on a subcommittee my last year as trustee. I'm intimately familiar with at least the first versions of the first 4 chapters of the book. I will tell you that the process that was followed through the course of that life cycle of that particular piece of material was odd compared to other pieces of AA material that we have produced. Odd from the standpoint of when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, people who have been sober any length of time at all that had been engaged or involved in service said everything in AA moves at the speed of trust. And I would think that the trust relationship, second tradition, takes 2 sides, right? You got to have somebody to do the serving, but you got to have a whole lot of people to do the trusting. And so in order for us to effectively seal that deal, I understand about, legal constraints, but there are certainly ways for the fellowship of AA to form some type of supporting group conscience around a piece of material prior to its actual adoption and publication. Members of the conference this year, delegates, I don't speak for any of them, I was not in that conference, but they felt the same way. They felt that the process that had been followed was perhaps absent the traditional pieces that had been followed in prior years for different pieces of literature, pamphlets. We don't even change a line in a pamphlet until we know for sure that it's the right line to change. We've had 8 or 10 hour discussions on the floor of the General Service Conference just talking about punctuation. That also drives those Class A trustees insane. And they got 6 years on that board, right? So I don't discount, again, the importance or perhaps the usefulness of that particular new piece of material, but there were appeals that were filed, Concept 5 appeals, by sitting delegates in the conference, which was historic. It has not, to my knowledge, ever been done since 1951, the first year of the conference, because the delegates were concerned about the process and concerned perhaps about an absence of what they would consider to be a collective and informed group of delegates. And so we're now at a place where we have, a conference-approved piece of material that I think because of haste and some degree of heavy stress, it did not follow to the letter the mandate of the conference. There were adjustments that should have been made before the book was actually printed, and those adjustments were not made. So those first 70,000 copies that are now, I believe, exhausted, they are missing what the conference felt like were necessary changes. So again, I speak to that not to try to zero in on any one particular piece of material and trying the best of my ability through prayer before I got to the lectern to make sure that I'm delivering that information objectively, but just to stress the importance of ownership and support of any piece of material that has the AA brand on it. from all of us. Now, there are very few, if any, of the 1,000-odd people that are gathered together here at Stateline this weekend that are probably in home groups where, the running joke is you went to the restroom at the wrong time and you came back in the room and you were the GSR. But I would hate to tell you, you probably may be already aware that the majority of AA groups, that's kind of the way the election runs. Right? We don't say that you ought to be punished, but we'll make you the GSR and you'll learn to be a better AA member. But just remember, in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, that could be the Pacific Regional Trustee. Now that we allow drunks to chair the board, it could be the chair of the General Service Board. So familiarity with certain aspects of, quote-unquote, the structure, I think those are opportunities. I believe absolutely they're opportunities, even if we never occupy any role in, quote-unquote, the third legacy of service. They're opportunities for us to understand that the spiritual does, in fact, trump anything and everything that would be of a material or legalistic origin. The conference charter is really one of the single most important documents that Alcoholics Anonymous possesses that describes in very short but powerful detail how much AA members trust one another. AA groups actually delegate their conscience collectively to a single human being and allow that single AA member the opportunity to carry that conscience, the conscience of an assembly of members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and of enormous spiritual import. We allow that AA member, we delegate that AA member, we trust that AA member to carry that conscience and to, quote-unquote, do the business of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then to come back to us and tell us what they saw, what they heard, and what they felt. There was a regional forum in the Southeast last weekend. There were a significant number of delegates from all across the United States. The regional forum is hosted by a region, but it's not a regional event. In other words, when Pacific Regional Forum happens and wherever they have it out here next time, any and every AA member who's even remotely interested, we are excited if they're even remotely interested coming to the forum. There were multiple past delegates that received communication. It was casual communication. It wasn't formal. It was very informal. Along the lines of what motivated you to want to come to the Southeast Regional Forum. It's not your region. Well, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, they said, oh my gosh, member of AA first, right? Member of AA first. The Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous must be supported. The health and well-being of your home group, wherever your home group has to be, I don't have a voice nor a vote there, but I'm personally vested in the health and well-being of your home group. To the extent possible that I can support that in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And they said that was a fundamental role of, let's just say, of leadership in AA. I didn't know about how any of that stuff worked. Certainly I didn't. I didn't care about financial reports when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't want to know or care about anything about numbers. What I realized in my 4 years on the board is that the sacrifices that are made, and there are sacrifices that are made, every single time crumpled dollars find their way into AA baskets, that those sacrifices, I believe the disconnect between offices and boards and the fellowship that those entities serve, there's a fundamental disconnect. When Bill tells in his story how much this banker laughed because they were, chatting in millions and all this other kind of stuff, we would have some fairly surreal conversations, and just I, as an AA member, about things that I thought were untenable on the expense side of the ledger. And that's a politically correct way of saying spending like drunken sailors. We had a past trustee from out in California that said, and no offense to the drunken sailors, right? How many of you been to GSO? Tons of you, I'm sure. You know that little rinky-dink conference room we got where they have the AA meeting on Friday morning? A little tiny room. We got a little conference table shoved in there and maybe 10 or 12 chairs behind it. We had just come out of the pandemic. $4 million, thank goodness, out of the reserve fund. We didn't lay off, furlough, fire, not a single employee. You and I kept all that going. Book sales dropped from $1.2 million a month to $300,000 a month in April of the first pandemic year. And the fellowship responded like we had never seen before. But things were tight. I was the treasurer of the AA World Services Board. We went to New York and talked about the mid-year budget. And they said, we have got to do something about the sound system in this conference room. And I said, what? And they said, it's just not clear in here. And I said, well, what does that mean? Well, we've got a couple of bids, and the best one we've got is $35,000. And I realize our budgets are multi-million dollars a year, but I said, y'all all have home groups. You know what we do when we have a sound system problem in a home group in Alcoholics Anonymous? You get somebody with $50 or less, go down to Home Depot and get you some little box speakers, and you wire that stuff up, make a commitment out of it, one and done. And I said, if your room's small enough, you don't even spend the $50. You just add to the format of your meeting, talk louder. And I said, I'm not saying that we don't necessarily need a premium sound system in the conference room of the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous. But if we actually consider a little bit of the history, the last year, vision for the upcoming year, perhaps we might reconsider if that's the most prudent and effective use of the AA dollar. So, to carry that on through, I realize that none of us are charged with any decision-making process when it comes to any level of management or micromanagement. We have executives and boards that are primarily responsible for that. But for the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous to actually say, you don't need that information, causes me pause. The way I was raised in AA, and I haven't been here that long, August 25th, 1997. The way I was raised in Alcoholics Anonymous, they said, go to that regional forum. Go to that microphone and say, I want to know how much you spend for copy paper in a year at the General Service Office. And I did it just as a test. And they didn't give the answer from the podium because they didn't have an answer that they really could support. I got a letter in the mail, no email back then. I got a letter in the mail, and they told me how many sheets of paper they ran through in 1998, how much money it cost. And at the end they said, thank you. Your contributions make the operation of this office possible. And you know the most impactful part of that experience for me? I felt like I really had a piece of this deal, right? I really felt like I had a vested interest in what that office was doing in order to carry the message or help us carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous around the world. buy-in, right? To actually have support of a majority conscience of members of the fellowship. I think that's what Bill always envisioned. He knew that this faceless, nameless group of trusted servants and paid employees, people that we didn't know really what they looked like or how they talked or acted, that the fellowship would never tolerate that in the long term, because that's what we had the first 25 years of our existence. And that what we wanted people to whom we could hold directly accountable. That's where the forums came from. They went up to the Pacific Northwest, I think it was either Oregon or Washington, Dr. Jack Norris and a lady named Cora Louise Belcher, long gone. Dr. Jack was chair of the General Service Board for years and years. Cora Louise had worked at the office. Alabama girl who'd taken a wrong turn before she got sober and ended up in New York. And they went up to just have a little meeting, right? You know how we have a little meeting? And they tore them up there. They chewed them up. And Dr. Jack came back and said, there's a fundamental problem with the way we're communicating with the fellowship. And that we needed to improve that communication. Interestingly enough, 50 years ago, 1975, when all that happened, it was a two-way communication then. In other words, board members had Q&A or Ask It Basket or whatever they were going to have, and the fellowship asked questions, engaged in dialogue. Board members either gave the answers or collected the answers and gave the reports, and that information then went through the normal channels so that members of Alcoholics Anonymous could all equally benefit. If they wanted to avail themselves of the information was there. During my 4 years on the board, we were masters at outbound communication. But we were horrible at listening, collectively. I was amazed at my own regional service assembly, Southwest Regional Service Assembly in October, that there were 4 or 5 AA members at a stand-up mic on the floor, and a member, let's just say, asked an awkward question. It wasn't an abrasive question, and it certainly wasn't asked with nearly as much gusto as we've heard lots of questions asked in AA, and it's passion. It's not anger, it's passion. It's passion for my sobriety, your sobriety, our collective sobriety. It's passion. And there was plenty of time on the clock, and there were plenty of people in line, and the trustee said, no more questions, because questions cause controversy. And I thought, well, if you thought you had controversy before, you really bought it now. We're not a suspicious lot of folks. There's no malfeasance. People aren't carrying money out of the General Service Office at night in black trash bags or any of that other kind of stuff. They're just making decisions without feeling the weight of the fellowship. And I believe that that's not an effective way for them to fully exercise their role as trusted servants for us. It's unfair to the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous to not have ample input and involvement from their constituency. It hinders their ability to effectively serve the fellowship. And if they don't know that in a current rotation, the fellowship can help them with that, right? And I don't mean that in an ugly way. I don't mean that in an invasive way. I think we're all more than cordial with one another and polite. But I just think about our responsibility to the future of this thing, right? The state of the nation. If we think, with those of us with, let's just say, 10 or more years of sobriety, not thinking so much about what AA was like when we first came to AA, but more importantly, like those old-time guys that I thought when I was new they were speaking in riddles. Now I understand more and more exactly what they were saying. they'd say stuff like, we're going to show you how to weave yourself into the fabric of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought, what in the world is that? And now I understand events like this. I understand exactly what that means. I see that. I know exactly what that means, right? But they would say, we want you to leave AA better than it was when you found it, right? And in order to get that done, I think collectively we have to make decisions. If perhaps we believe as an informed group conscience collectively that AA is exclusive rather than inclusive, that AA is for some reason not accessible in one manner or another manner, those directives, those resources, those tools are all going to have to source from within Alcoholics Anonymous. They're going to have to source those ideas, and believe me, we are amazingly resourceful when it comes to knowing what we need in order to most effectively carry our message. Those ideas are going to have to come root and branch from the membership of AA. And so there's not so much about apathy and indifference. I think it's more along the lines of we have these delegated representatives that are responsible to carry conscience or carry our authority or this or that or the other thing. But it must be the group or the district or the area that sits back and says, wait, we should be due some report. There should be a 5 or 10 minute window of time from behind the podium so we can listen to what the results were from the last intergroup meeting or central office meeting or area assembly or district meeting, and members of Alcoholics Anonymous being engaged enough for the future health and well-being of the movement. Because this is what Bill designed. It's what Bill envisioned that we would need to use in order to make sure that Alcoholics Anonymous stayed Alcoholics Anonymous and existed, as Bill would say, as long as God would have us here. We're approaching, our 90th year of existence. As organizations go, we're moving into senior citizen status as organizations. If you look at the history of great family fortunes, we're in the 3rd/4th generation, and if all we do is spend the inheritance, we're in bad shape. We have to continue to invest, continue to replenish, continue to seek answers to questions, whether we agree with questions or not. Most difficult for a guy like me, listen as if we have no opinion. Try to the best of our ability to not be punitive, to try to engage with one another, know what we belong to. Our public record or perception. We had this thing called alcoholicsanonymous.com. Some of you are probably aware of that webpage, alcoholicsanonymous.com. It's resolved now, but it was a huge deal when I was the chair of the AA World Services Board. Members of AA were hot about it because you went to alcoholicsanonymous.com and it was basically a treatment referral. And so Alcoholics Anonymous, just like us.com. So there was more and more heat, and the general manager said, we need to call the lawyer. So we called the $1,500 an hour lawyer, and we had the board chair and me and the general manager and the big-time lawyer. And it had been going on for 15, 16 years, and we had just we'd played footsie with the guy, right? We'd said, please don't use blue and yellow on your webpage because it looks like AA. And he'd take it off. Oops, he'd take it off. And then we'd say, please don't use the same font that we use in Alcoholics, that kind of deal. We just played cat and mouse back and forth. So the lawyer had worked for us for years, not a member of AA, but he said, you will not prevail. If you litigate against this guy, there is no way. It will be long and protracted litigation, and you will not prevail. But he said, you are completely missing the boat. Use the good name of Alcoholics Anonymous to define Alcoholics Anonymous. If people know who you are and what you do and are clear about that, There's no way in the world that they go to something like alcoholicsanonymous.com and think that you're going to refer them to a treatment facility. Use the reputation of AA as you know it in order to define the parameters of your society, right? What he was basically saying is we individually and collectively are the best public information tool that Alcoholics Anonymous could ever possibly have. So the 1,000 of us that have invaded the Tuscany resort, when we think about our deportment individually and collectively, while we're on this property, whether we like it or not, our anonymity has probably collectively been pretty much broken. If we got one of these doohickeys on, they know we're with that group of people that don't drink for some strange reason and are extraordinarily polite, civil, well-behaved. You know, Billy talked about Jack. One of the things I'd never heard, I did not know that we deconstructed Bill's office right after Bill died. I never heard that. I think that is a phenomenal decision that was made. So we're not Bill be gone 54 years, January of 2025, that we're not walking around going, here's my most treasured possession. This is a little cube of the carpet from Bill's office at GSO, right? Like that little cube of carpet somehow has some magic elixir tied to it that meant permanent sobriety, right? And he talked a little bit about Jack Alexander. And I'd heard Jack Alexander's story. Most of us have. And I really thought Jack was somehow connected. You know, most of those early people, especially around the time the book was written, they were all somehow incestuously connected. You know what I mean? Somebody knew somebody had a relative that worked for Rockefeller. I mean, all that stuff's just all kind of mixed up. And I didn't know that Jack Alexander was an investigative reporter. You know, one of those people, remember back on old news, like 80s and 90s, every city had them, where they'd chase the bad guys, you know, and they'd slam the door in their face and all that kind of stuff. He was that guy. So he came to AA, to the old clubhouse in New York. They didn't give him advance information. We have a Southwestern Medical School deal in Dallas fall every year, second-year medical students. We're the lab rats for these med students. And, you know, most groups, because we invite them to an open AA meeting, most groups, you know, you get a lot of advance information. You make announcements. The medical students are coming. Wear underwear. You know, the medical students are coming. Right? So Jack Alexander came, and all he did, nothing else, open AA meeting, right? All he did was he came to AA, and he went to the coffee bar before the AA meeting started, and he said, why are you here? Are you staying or are you going? Have you been here very long? Then he sat down and he listened to a 15 or 20-minute pitch from somebody who couldn't have been sober very long. Bill had only been sober about 5 years. And then after the meeting was over, he had that little meeting after the meeting. You know, there wasn't gravel spinning in the parking lot 2 minutes after the meeting was over. They were actually engaging with one another, and he did some more interaction with these Yahoo AA members. What's going on with this deal? Because he was sure we were a Ponzi scheme. I mean, we were telling people that if one alcoholic shared experience, strength, and hope with another alcoholic, both of them got better. And the biggest lie we were telling is we didn't charge anything for that. So then he went home and he wrote this article about AA that blew the lid off AA. It was the Facebook of its day, right? So in my home group, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, Chicago group of Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't know, every 6 or 7 months, I get there early, right? We like to get there early. And people are doing early commitments, and I stand over in the corner of the room, I close my eyes for a couple of minutes, just like I've done while I've been here a couple of times, and I just listen. I listen to the energy and enthusiasm of a room of Alcoholics Anonymous. I just listen. I feel what's going on in the room. Then we have an AA member comes and shares their experience, strength, and hope. Close your eyes, listen to the talk. What kind of AA message is coming out of that lectern? Then after that meeting's over, when we're talking about dinner and thanking the speaker, one more time, step to the side and listen to how we're engaging with one another, interacting with one another. People we know and people we don't. And it's just a barometer for me, just individually, as a single member of Chicago Group of AA. If Jack Alexander had been in that same room that I was in that night, and Jack had seen what I saw, and heard what I heard, and felt what I felt, and he was going home to write an article about Alcoholics Anonymous, what kind of article would he write? What would he write? And that holds me to a sense of personal responsibility to make sure that I don't abrogate my responsibility as a sober member of AA, the pass-through gift, that I'm not one of those third or fourth generation AA members who's going to sit around and rest on my laurels and spend my inheritance. What I want to try to do is leave Alcoholics Anonymous a little bit better than it was when I found it. I'm thankful and I'm grateful and I'm honored and privileged to sit among you this weekend. And I thank you for listening.